Ragnarok is the Norse end of the world, but the surviving stories do not give one fixed account. The clearest version comes from the Poetic Edda and Snorri Sturluson's Prose Edda, both recorded in medieval Iceland, long after the pagan age that shaped the myths. Together, they describe a world marked for collapse not only by battle, but by winter, famine, broken bonds, and the failure of the old order. To follow Ragnarok clearly, it helps to begin before the final conflict, with the warnings that lead into it and the gods who try too late to hold back what has already been set in motion. Later readers saw in these stories both a memory of northern cosmology and a reflection on endings themselves. The older sources do not agree on every detail, but they preserve the same broad pattern: destruction, loss, and then a difficult beginning again. Ragnarok begins long before the final battle, because Norse myth places that battle inside a world already divided, crowded, and under strain. The surviving poems and prose sources do not describe the cosmos in exactly the same way, but they agree on the basic shape of it. There is no single empty sky, only a layered world of linked realms, each with its own powers and dangers. The end makes more sense once that world is laid out first. At the center stands Midgard, the human realm. It is not sealed off from everything else, but a protected space within a larger and more hostile order. Humans live within boundaries that matter, even if those boundaries are never fully secure. Around Midgard are other lands and levels of being, and above and beyond them are the strongholds of the gods, especially Asgard, the whole world of the Aesir. In the sources, these are not abstract heavens, they are places of rule, counsel, memory, alliance, and conflict. The gods are not distant principles. They are a ruling family with obligations, rivals, and a history. That family structure helps explain why the myths often move through feuds, bargains, and acts of repayment. Power in this tradition is personal and political as well as divine. The greatest opposition to them comes from the Jotnar, usually translated as giants, though that word can be misleading if it makes them sound like simple monsters. In the Norse sources, they can be enemies, but they can also be kin through marriage or ancestry. Sometimes they are hostile forces outside order. Sometimes they are part of the same old world the gods must negotiate with. Their homeland is often associated with Jotunheim, though the poems do not always draw those borders in the same way. What matters is the larger pattern. The gods do not rule an uncontested cosmos. Their authority is real, but it exists beside other powers that are old enough to belong to creation itself. In some stories, those powers are linked to wisdom, prophecy, and ancient memory. In others, they are tied to disruption and threat. The tradition allows both at once. Below the world of the living lies the realm of the dead, and here, too, the traditions vary. The dead do not all go to one place. The surviving sources preserve several destinations, and they do not always describe them in the same terms. Hell, both a place and later a ruling figure in tradition, is one of the best known. It is not always a place of punishment. More often, it is the underworld where many who die of sickness, old age, or ordinary causes are thought to go. That detail matters, because Ragnarok is not only about gods and giants. It takes place in a universe where death is already built into the order of things. Other dead may be taken to halls of slain warriors, especially in later poetic and prose traditions that emphasize Odin's role among the battle dead. The sources do not collapse these destinations into one moral system. Instead, they preserve a cosmos in which different kinds of death can lead to different kinds of afterlife. The same is true of Yggdrasil, the great tree or ash that appears across the tradition as the central image of connection. In the Eddic poems, it stands at the center of understanding. Its roots and branches reach into different worlds, and beings move through or dwell in its reaches in ways that tie life, death, and destiny together. The tree is not just decoration. It shows how the Norse cosmos works, not as separate sealed chambers, but as a living structure under pressure. If one part weakens, the rest is affected. The tree's image also helps explain why knowledge in these myths is so often costly. Odin's pursuit of wisdom, whether through sacrifice, travel, or encounters with hidden powers, belongs to a world where insight is never free. The structure of the cosmos has to be endured, read, and sometimes paid for. That is why Ragnarok is not introduced as a sudden invasion of chaos into an otherwise perfect world. It is the breaking point of an order that is already balanced, but never secure. The gods live in splendor, but they do so in a universe where limits exist and where enemies have their own claims. Even divine power reflects that strain. Odin, in the later sources, is tied to wisdom won at cost, rather than effortless knowledge. Thor's strength helps hold boundaries in place, but only through constant conflict. Tyr's older reputation points toward law, oath, and sacrifice. The gods are powerful, but they are not timeless in a simple sense. They belong to a world that can fail. The myths repeatedly show them acting through obligation rather than complete control. They make bargains, enforce order, and prepare for threats, but they cannot remove uncertainty from existence. That is the real starting point of Ragnarok. Before the signs, before the fighting, before the death of gods and the burning of the world, there is a cosmos already shaped by tension. Gods, humans, giants, and the dead are not separate stories. The Norse gods do not appear in the sources as a single flawless court that only later breaks apart. They are already the result of conflict. Before Ragnarok becomes a story of destruction, it is a story of settlement, compromise, and the memory of an older war among the gods themselves. The clearest version of that older conflict appears in the tradition preserved in the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda, where the two divine groups most often named are the Aesir and the Vanir. The Aesir are the better-known ruling gods in many of the surviving poems: Odin, Thor, Tyr, and others linked with sovereignty, battle, law, and kingship. The Vanir belong to a different divine family, more closely associated in later interpretation with fertility, prosperity, seafaring wealth, and the managed abundance of the land. The boundary between the two groups is not always neat, and the medieval sources were written after centuries of change. Even so, the division matters because it preserves the memory of an earlier separation before order was established. In the poems and in Snorri Sturluson's retelling, the two groups are not just labels for different spheres. They are treated as distinct powers with their own histories, and the fact that later tradition remembers both suggests that older religious ideas were being organized, not invented from nothing. According to the myths, the Aesir and Vanir fought a war and then made peace. The stories do not give a full historical account, and they were not written as history in the modern sense, but the settlement that follows is important. Hostages are exchanged, the divine families are joined, some figures become part of the Aesir's world, while others keep their older associations. In the best-known version, the Vanir send Jord, and later his children Freyr and Freya are also linked with the Aesir's circle. That is not a minor detail. It shows that the settlement was more than a ceasefire. It was an incorporation of powers once imagined as separate. The myth does not erase conflict, it folds conflict into the structure of the world. The gods rule because they have survived a war, not because war is absent. The logic resembles an old political memory. Power is stabilized through exchange, not purity. That changes how the whole mythic universe works. If even the gods once fought one another and had to negotiate peace, then the cosmos of the old Norse stories is never fully settled. Stability exists, but only after struggle, and only in forms that remain exposed to loss. The later poems and prose retellings do not pause to explain this every time, because they assume a world already organized by inherited tensions. Odin sits at the center of divine rule, but he is not a distant creator outside the system. He is a ruler inside a fragile order. Thor protects that order, yet he does so by meeting threats directly and repeatedly. Tyr carries an older echo of law and oath, but even his role points towards sacrifice rather than easy control. These are not abstract virtues. They are functions in a world where authority must be defended, maintained, and paid for. The balance among the gods is also tied to geography and function. Asgard is the stronghold of the Aesir, but it is not the whole world. The gods exist in relation to Midgard, the human realm, and to a wider cosmos that includes giants, spirits, and the dead. The myths often present these realms as distinct, but they are never fully sealed off from one another. Rivers, roads, marriage, raids, fate, and prophecy move between them. That means the gods do not govern an isolated paradise. They rule from within a larger and more dangerous order, and that order already contains rivals. In some stories, giants are enemies. In others, they are kin by marriage, guests, or necessary participants in the larger system. The categories matter, but they are not simple opposite. The divine world is marked by contact as much as separation. This is why Ragnarok is such an effective mythic ending. It does not invent vulnerability at the last moment. It reveals what was always there. The gods are magnificent, but they are not beyond history. They have enemies, obligations, broken promises, and old debts. Some of those debts are political, in the mythic sense of alliances and hostages. Some are familial. Some are built into the way the cosmos was arranged after earlier violence. The world of the gods is not a finished monument. It is an arrangement that can still fail. Even the strongest gods belong to a pattern of temporary order, and that pattern gives the final struggle its force. The fall at Ragnarok is not random collapse. It is the outcome of a world whose foundation already includes conflict, negotiation, and compromise. Later readers often tried to make these stories fit a cleaner sequence, but the surviving traditions resist that. The divine past is full of disputes, and peace is only temporary. The first signs of Ragnarok do not come into a blank world. Ragnarok begins with signs in the air: the great winter, failing seasons, and the slow breakdown of trust among gods and human beings. In the surviving poems, especially those preserved in the Poetic Edda, the end of the world is not introduced as a sudden event. It arrives through a series of disturbances that show the old order loosening. Weather turns against people, kinship stops holding, and the ordinary patterns that make life predictable begin to fail. That gradual weakening matters because it makes the catastrophe legible long before the final battle starts. The world is not simply destroyed, it first becomes unreliable. The best-known omen is Fimbulwinter, the great winter that comes before the final battle. The sources describe it as a long and severe cold, with successive winters and little or no relief. In mythic terms, this is more than an extreme season. It signals that the balance of the cosmos is under pressure. The poems do not offer a scientific explanation, but they do give a cultural one. For the people who told and heard these stories, survival depended on the regular return of seasons, on stored grain, on livestock, and on weather that stayed within familiar limits. A winter that does not properly end becomes a sign that the world itself is no longer keeping faith with human life. It is a failure of rhythm, and in a pre-modern society that depended so heavily on predictable cycles, that kind of failure carried real weight. The collapse is not limited to climate. The poems also emphasize social disorder. Brothers turn against brothers, kinship fails, oaths lose their force. That pattern matters because Old Norse society placed real weight on obligation, honor, and the keeping of sworn promises. The myth takes those concerns and pushes them to an extreme conclusion. Ragnarok is a cosmic war, but it is also the moment when the basic terms of human community stop working. Once the bonds between relatives and allies can no longer be trusted, the larger order of the world begins to unravel with them. The violence in the myth is therefore not random. It begins in the breakdown of the relationships that were supposed to hold violence in check. This is why the omens feel so important in the sources. They connect the fate of the gods to the daily experience of ordinary people. In the poems, the world does not fall apart only at the level of heaven and battle. It first shows weakness in places everyone would understand: in winter, in famine, in fear, in broken promises. The disaster is supernatural, but it is described through familiar forms of instability. That is one reason the myth remains so durable. It turns cosmic collapse into a set of recognizable human pressures, the kind that threaten households and communities long before they become matters of legend. The surviving texts do not always present these signs in exactly the same sequence. The Poetic Edda preserves older verse that can be compact and elusive, while the Prose Edda of Snorri Sturluson, written in the 13th century, gives the material more explicit narrative shape. Snorri's account is later, and in some places it organizes the tradition more clearly than the poems do. Even so, both traditions agree on the central point. Before the final battle, the world enters a period of visible decay. The signs are not hidden. They can be felt in the cold, in the strain on communities, and in the weakening of sacred and social order. The later prose version helps explain the sequence, but the older poetic material already assumes that listeners would understand these omens as part of a larger pattern of disintegration. The Great Winter matters because it marks the first undeniable proof that stability is gone. It is not yet the destruction itself, but it tells us that destruction has already begun. Once the seasons no longer behave as they should, the rest of Ragnarok no longer seems distant. The end has entered the world in a form people can recognize: cold, mistrust, and the slow collapse of everything that once seemed secure. In that sense, the opening signs are not just atmospheric details. Fimbulwinter is the long Norse winter that comes before Ragnarok, and it is one of the clearest signs that the old order is breaking down. In the surviving poems and in Snorri Sturluson's 13th century Prose Edda, it is described as 3 winters in a row, with no summer between them. The sources do not give exactly the same level of detail, but they agree on the core pattern. The cold deepens, the seasons fail, and the world moves toward collapse. This is not treated as an ordinary hard winter. It is the great winter that announces the end. That matters because the myth comes from a world where winter was never just background weather. In the Norse and wider Scandinavian setting, survival depended on stored food, livestock, and seasons arriving when they were expected to. A winter that did not end would have meant more than discomfort. It would have meant strain on households, shortages of food, and pressure on community life. The myth takes that familiar danger and enlarges it into a sign of cosmic failure. Before the gods meet their enemies in battle, ordinary life begins to fail in ways people would have recognized immediately. The poems also connect Fimbulwinter to social disorder. In some versions, kinship ties collapse and brothers turn on brothers. That detail matters because it shows that the winter is not only a change in climate, it is also a breakdown in trust. Family obligations, law, and peace among neighbors no longer hold the same force. The world does not simply become colder, it becomes less stable in every sense. The long winter reaches into human conduct and weakens the ties that make society possible. In a culture where feud, oath, and kinship all mattered deeply, that reversal would have been understood as a sign that the world was losing its structure from within. Snorri's prose Edda lays out this sequence in a direct way. He treats Fimbulwinter as one of the clear omens that Ragnarok is approaching, following earlier signs and disturbances. The poetic Edda, especially in the prophetic poem Völuspá, gives the same broad picture in a more compressed form. There, Osiris looks ahead to a world in distress before the final conflict. The poems do not stop to explain every practical consequence, but the implication is the same. The age before Ragnarok is marked by both environmental collapse and moral unraveling. Cold and violence belong together. This long winter also fits into a wider pattern of omens that prepare the way for the final battle. In some traditions, it comes after the strain of betrayals, after the breaking of social bonds, and before the release of monstrous powers that have been held in check. The sequence matters. The end does not begin with thunder and open war. It begins with failure that people would first experience in daily life, in empty stores, in damaged herds, in weather that no longer follows the proper cycle. By placing Fimbulwinter before the great confrontation, the myths make the collapse feel gradual and unavoidable rather than sudden. That pairing gives the myth its shape. Ragnarok is often remembered as a great battle among gods and monsters, but the road to that battle begins earlier, in the weakening of the world itself. The cosmos in Norse myth is not a machine that suddenly breaks. It wears down, its bonds loosen, the seasons become unreliable, and that unreliability spreads outward into human life. Fimbulwinter is therefore both a symptom and a warning. It shows that the structure of the world is already damaged, and it signals that the damage is no longer containable. Later readers sometimes treat Fimbulwinter as if it were only an apocalyptic image, but the older material is more grounded than that. It belongs to a culture that knew the force of severe winters and knew how quickly climate could test even a strong community. The myth turns that experience into prophecy. Loki belongs to the myth in a different way from Odin, Thor, or Freya. The oldest sources do not place him among the Aesir in any simple sense, even though he moves among them. He is part of the divine company, but never fully at home in it. That ambiguity matters because Loki is the figure who crosses boundaries, and in Norse myth that often means exposing the places where those boundaries are already failing. In the surviving poems and prose retellings, Loki is not a single fixed character. In earlier material, he can be clever and useful, especially in stories where his schemes solve problems for the gods as often as they create them. He is the one who gets them out of trouble, usually after causing the trouble first. He is also a social outsider, a shape changer, and at times a humiliator of the other gods. In later material, especially Snorri Sturluson's prose Edda, he becomes more sharply defined as the adversary who will lead the enemies of the gods at the end. The older poems are less tidy. They do not always explain his origin, and they do not always force him into the role of a planned traitor. The shift happens gradually across the tradition. That gradual shift matters. Loki's breaking point is not one single act in the oldest evidence. It is a pattern. He moves from troublesome companion to the figure most closely linked with irreversible loss. Even before Baldr's death, the myths place him near the edge of social order. He is bound to the gods by oath and association, but not by loyalty in the ordinary sense. He knows how to move between groups that should remain separate, and he knows how to turn knowledge into injury. That makes him dangerous long before the final battle arrives. Some modern retellings make Loki a straightforward villain from the start, but the older tradition is more unsettled than that. He is not a demon in the Christian sense, and it is probably misleading to read him that way. He is closer to a mythic troublemaker whose gifts become catastrophic when trust breaks down. In a world where kinship, oath, and hospitality matter, that kind of figure can do enormous damage. The stories about him are not just about deception, they are about the failure of relationships that were supposed to hold the cosmos together. The sources also disagree about how much of Loki's later role was present from the beginning. Some scholars think his enemy role was shaped more fully in later literary retellings, especially under Christian-era authors who preferred sharper contrasts between order and disorder. Others point out that the older poems already contain the seeds of that pattern, even if they do not explain it in the same way. What is clear is that by the time the Ragnarok material takes its familiar form, Loki has become inseparable from the end of the gods. He is no longer merely mischievous, he stands with the forces that will break the world open. That change becomes clearer once his children enter the story. Loki's family is not a normal family in the human sense, and the myths use that strangeness to signal danger. In the surviving texts, his offspring are tied to the margins of the world and to its eventual undoing. Fenrir, Jormungandr, and Hel are not children in a domestic tale. They are embodiments of threat, each associated with a different frontier: the wolf, the serpent, and the realm of the dead. Fenrir is the most immediate threat because he is a beast of force held under control only as long as control lasts. Jormungandr is threat turned outward into geography, a being whose size and position define the limits of the earth itself. Hel is more complex. In the older material, she rules the underworld realm that bears her name, and later sources give her a more personified role as daughter of Loki and ruler of the dead who do not die in battle. That picture may reflect later systematizing, but the broad idea remains the same. Loki's household is linked to the destinations where life ends or where life cannot continue as the gods wish it to. The stories of these children help explain why Loki changes from errant ally to looming enemy. They are not just separate monsters. They are part of the same pattern of strain. Each one marks a place where the world's order is provisional. Fenrir must be contained. Jormungandr must be kept at the edge of the sea. Hel governs a realm that the living cannot reverse. In each case, the myth places a limit around something overwhelming, and that limit is always temporary. The gods know this, which is why they act early. The Binding of Fenrir is the clearest example, and it shows how fear shapes divine action in the mythic past. Fenrir grows among the gods, but his strength becomes alarming. The sources do not agree on every detail of his upbringing, yet the basic pattern is consistent. The gods see that he is becoming too powerful, and they decide to restrain him before he can harm them. At first, they test him with ordinary chains, and he breaks them. That failure matters. It shows that the gods are not all-powerful. Their solutions do not always work, so they commission a special binding, Gleipnir, a fetter made from impossible things in Snorri's retelling, the sound of a cat's footfall, the beard of a woman, the roots of a mountain, and other unreal materials. This belongs to the later literary form of the myth, but it survived because it serves the story well. Only something made from what does not normally exist can hold Fenrir. Even then, the wolf does not accept the bond without warning. He agrees to the test only if one of the gods places a hand in his mouth as a pledge of good faith. Tyr does so, and loses the hand when Fenrir discovers the trap. That loss is not a side note. It is one of the earliest signs that the gods will pay a cost for every attempt to maintain order. The binding works, but only by creating a new wound. Fenrir is restrained, yet he is also insulted, and the myth treats that injury as part of the future catastrophe. The wolf's rage is not random. It has a history. The gods do not defeat a monster so much as postpone his vengeance. Jormungandr is linked to a different kind of danger. He is thrown into the sea, where he grows so large that he circles the world and bites his own tail, or is imagined as surrounding the inhabited earth in a great ring. The exact form varies between sources and interpretations, but the meaning is stable. The serpent belongs to the ocean that presses against the boundaries of land. He is a reminder that the world is finite, enclosed, and vulnerable. In some myths, Thor later meets him in episodes of fishing and combat, and those encounters reinforce the same idea. The serpent is too large to ignore and too tightly bound to the world's edge to be removed. The sea is not just water in these stories. It is a boundary, and Jormungandr makes that boundary visible. Hel gives the family another kind of reach. She is not a battlefield enemy in the same way as Fenrir or Jormungandr, but she rules over the dead who cannot return. Her realm is the destination for many who die away from the honor of combat, and in the Baldr story she becomes the keeper of a loss that cannot easily be reversed. That makes Loki's family complete in a grim sense. One child threatens the gods directly, another surrounds their world, and another keeps the dead in place. In later prose, Hel's Hall is described with the dry clarity that characterizes much of Snorri's writing, giving the underworld a fixed shape in the imagination. The older poems are less expansive, but they still treat her realm as part of cosmic structure rather than a place of moral punishment in a later Christian sense. By this point, Loki's role is easier to understand. He is the link between all these pressures. He belongs to the divine company, but he stands at the point where divine confidence fails. He is present when boundaries blur, and he becomes more important when the gods try to restore those boundaries by force. The old poems do not always explain his motives in psychological terms, and it is safer not to impose modern expectations on him. What they do show is a figure whose actions repeatedly expose weakness. He helps the gods and harms them. He binds them together and drives them apart. He is necessary to the story because he reveals how unstable the story already is. That is why Ragnarok cannot be understood only as a war between gods and monsters. It is also the outcome of a long accumulation of distrust, punishment, and unresolved injury. Loki's breaking point is not merely his own. It is the point at which the divine household can no longer absorb what he represents. Once Fenrir is bound, once Jormungandr has become the sea's encircling threat, and once Hel has been fixed as ruler of the dead, the myth has already arranged its cast for the end. Loki stands at the center of that arrangement, not as a harmless trickster, but as the figure through whom divine disorder has become impossible to contain. That matters because the final turn against the gods does not begin only with Loki's eventual punishment. It begins much earlier, in the logic of every bargain that the gods make with him. In some stories, he is the one who acquires what the gods need by risking humiliation, theft, or deception. He brings back treasures, repairs disasters, and turns his own body into a tool, but each success also leaves behind a debt. He is praised when he solves a crisis, then blamed when the next one emerges. The myth does not treat that pattern as accidental. It is one of the ways it shows how fragile divine order really is. The gods depend on a figure they do not trust, and that dependence becomes part of the ruin. Baldr's death will later make that tension impossible to ignore, but the ground has already been prepared. Loki has a talent for finding the weak point in every arrangement, and the stories repeatedly place him near moments when a hidden flaw becomes visible. That is why he can seem almost useful in one episode and utterly destructive in another. The older tradition is not interested in giving him a single moral label. It presents him as a force that tests structures by touching them where they are most vulnerable. When the structure holds, he looks like a trickster. When it fails, he looks like the cause. Seen in that light, Loki's breaking point is not only the moment when he turns fully against the gods. Loki's children are Fenrir, Jormungandr, and Hel. And in the surviving Norse sources, they are not treated as ordinary members of a divine family. They are signs of what is coming. Each one occupies a different boundary of the world, and together they mark the places where the gods cannot fully keep control. Fenrir stands close to the gods themselves, Jormungandr surrounds the inhabited world from the sea, and Hel rules the dead below. Ragnarok is not introduced as a sudden surprise. Its shape is visible long before the final battle begins. Fenrir is the clearest example. In the prose Edda and in the poetic tradition behind it, he grows up among the gods, and his strength soon becomes a problem. That matters because Fenrir is not an enemy found outside the divine world. He is raised within it. The gods see him mature in their own company, and their fear grows with him. His binding is one of the major episodes leading toward Ragnarok, but it begins as an attempt to control a danger already living at the center of the household. The myth does not present this as a simple victory over a beast. It shows the gods trying to contain a threat their own dealings have allowed to take shape. In Snorri Sturluson's account, the binding also depends on deception and craft. The gods do not overpower Fenrir directly. They persuade him to submit to a test of strength, then restrain him with a magical fetter that ordinary force could not provide. The pattern is revealing. The danger is not removed. It is managed, briefly, by trickery. The old order survives by postponement, not by solving the problem. The poems preserve that anxiety in a more compressed form. By the time the audience meets Fenrir fully, he is already tied to the end of things. He is not merely fierce, he is destined. Later tradition also remembers the wolf's role in the death of Odin, which makes his binding more than an isolated episode. It is part of a chain of causes. The gods act because they fear what Fenrir will become, but their own actions help define the path toward that future. The story is less about one monster than about a divine household that recognizes too late that it cannot keep every force inside acceptable limits. Jormungandr, the Midgard serpent, belongs to a different kind of boundary. According to the later prose account, Loki and the giantess Angrboda have 3 children, and this serpent is one of them. The gods cast him into the sea, and he grows until he encircles the world. The image is famous because it does more than decorate the story. It gives the sea a place in the cosmic order. The inhabited world is not surrounded by emptiness. It is ringed by a living creature that can threaten it at the end of the age. Jormungandr is both held in place and impossible to forget. He is distant from human life, but he also defines its limits. In the poems, especially in the material used by Snorri, the serpent's role is not static. He appears as an opponent of Thor, and that rivalry gives the end of the world a concrete physical shape. When Thor and the serpent meet, The struggle is not abstract. It is one of the clearest signs that the border enclosing the human world will not hold forever. The sea setting matters here as well. For a culture shaped by travel, fishing, trade, and coastal life, the ocean was not an empty backdrop. It was a real edge of experience, a place of risk and movement. Jormungandr turns that edge into something alive. The serpent does not merely live in the waters, he becomes the outline of the world itself. Later retellings return to him often because he carries a structural idea. The world is enclosed and the enclosing force is dangerous. Hel completes the pattern. In the later sources, she is the ruler of the realm of the dead, and she too is one of Loki's children, usually with Angrboda in the Prose Edda's version of the story. Her realm is not the later Christian idea of hell. It is not described as a place of punishment for the wicked. Instead, it is the destination for those who die in a quieter or less martial way, especially those who do not fall in battle. That distinction matters because it shows how the Norse sources organized death. Hel's kingdom is cold, separate, and fixed. It is one of the world's proper divisions. In the mythic map, she belongs where life ends and the dead are gathered apart from the living. Her name becomes the name of the place, and that naming reflects a common habit in myth. A figure can stand both for a person and for the realm that person governs. Later Scandinavian tradition and Christian readers often blurred that difference, but the older material is more careful. Hel is not simply a demon. She is a sovereign of death's ordinary region. The sources do not flatten these three figures into one meaning. And it is better not to do that here. Fenrir is the immediate threat, close enough to the gods to make their fear personal. Jormungandr is the surrounding threat, the one that turns the sea into a boundary marked by danger. Hel is the final one, the ruler who receives the dead and completes the layout of the cosmos. They are different in role and in tone, but they are linked through family and through the expectation that each will matter at the end of the world. That expectation is not a late invention added for drama. It is built into the way the stories are told. The children are introduced as children, but the audience is meant to understand that they are also thresholds, each carrying a future outcome inside its present existence. That shared lineage is one reason the Children of Loki carry so much weight in the tradition. Loki himself belongs among the gods, but his offspring are aligned with the forces the gods cannot comfortably absorb. The surviving texts, especially the Prose Edda, make that point through parentage more than through argument. Loki's children cross boundaries just as he does, and their existence suggests that divine order has limits built into it from the beginning. The stories do not need to call them evil in a moral sense. They present them as warnings. Kinship does not guarantee safety, and the gods cannot rely on family ties to prevent disaster. In the surviving material, this is one of the clearest ways the myth explains why Ragnarok is not accidental. The end grows out of relationships already present in the divine world. Once the gods recognize what these children are likely to become, their responses follow the logic of rulers trying to defend an unstable world. Fenrir is the one they keep near and then struggle to bind. Jormungandr is the one they cast outward, only to find that the outer edge of the world is not far enough away. Fenrir is the child the gods fear most because his story is not only about strength, but about what happens when warning turns into policy. In the surviving myths, he is not born already at war with the gods. He is raised among them for a time, and that detail matters. The danger is recognized early, but it is not met with immediate violence. Instead, the gods keep him close, as if proximity might make the problem manageable. That choice fits a larger pattern in the myths. The divine order is not all-powerful. It is cautious, reactive, and often late. The fullest account of Fenrir's binding comes from the Prose Edda, especially Gylfaginning. There the gods watch him grow at a terrible pace. His size and strength become impossible to ignore, and the farther he advances, the less confidence they have that ordinary force will contain him. They test him with chains. He breaks them. They try again with stronger ones. He breaks those too. Each failure makes the situation clearer. The wolf is not only dangerous now, he is a future catastrophe already taking shape. At that point, the gods stop relying on open force and move toward a more careful scheme. The story makes the logic plain. Power alone does not solve every threat, especially when the threat is growing in the very place meant to hold it. This is where the myth turns from hesitation to deception. The gods ask Fenrir to submit to one more test, and they offer assurances when he becomes suspicious. The binding depends on trust, or at least on the appearance of trust. Fenrir senses that the bargain is not honest, so he demands a pledge. Someone must place a hand in his mouth while the bond is made, as a guarantee that he will be released if the gods cannot free him. Tyr accepts that risk. In later tradition, that is why Tyr loses his hand. He is not wounded in battle. He gives up his hand so the binding can happen. The injury acquires a specific meaning in the myth. Tyr's loss is the cost of a decision the gods chose to make, and the wound marks the point where trust has failed, but the bargain still has to be completed. The chain they use is Gleipnir, a binding made through craftsmanship rather than brute force. Its materials are deliberately impossible. The sources describe it as made from things that do not normally serve as materials at all, including the sound of a cat's footfall and other similarly unnatural ingredients. The point is not realism, it is symbolic ingenuity. Ordinary iron has failed, so only a bond drawn from paradox can hold a creature like Fenrir. The myth presents this as a last resort, but it also shows a habit of thought that runs through Norse legend more broadly. Words, vows, and crafted objects can carry as much weight as weapons. Gleipnir is not just a clever solution in the story, it signals that the gods are now relying on the hidden and the artificial, not the obvious strength that has already failed them. When Fenrir realizes he has been trapped, he does not simply submit. He understands the bargain for what it is, and the gods refuse to honor his demand for reassurance. To keep him from biting, they place a sword in his jaws. That detail appears in the later prose tradition, and it gives the scene its hard edge. The binding is not a neutral precaution, it is a humiliation. Fenrir is restrained, but he is also injured in the act of restraining him. The image is severe, but it is carefully structured. The gods do not just defeat the wolf, they force him into a position where his body itself becomes the site of their control. That helps explain why the myth feels less like a simple victory, and more like the beginning of a feud that cannot be ended cleanly. Not every source tells the sequence in exactly the same way. The Poetic Edda contains allusions to Fenrir's fate and to the coming struggle at Ragnarok. But the detailed scene of the binding is mostly known from the Prose Edda, written down in 13th century Iceland by Snorri Sturluson. That means the story reaches us through a later Christian-era compiler working with older material. Scholars usually treat the binding episode as part of the inherited mythic tradition, but the literary form we have is shaped by that retelling. The broad shape is stable, even if some details belong more clearly to Snorri's version. That distinction matters because Norse myth survives in fragments, and the surviving texts often preserve the outline of a story more securely than every line of its wording. What matters in every version is the grudge. Fenrir is not defeated in the moral sense, he is delayed. The gods secure themselves only for a time, and they do it by breaking the trust of a creature they were never able to control by force alone. That is why the binding becomes one of the key causes of Ragnarok in the mythic logic of the North. Fenrir's release is not an accident that comes later. It is the return of a debt the gods themselves created. Tyr loses his hand, the wolf loses his freedom, and the future battle is fixed in memory from that moment on. The binding does not remove the danger, it names it. Once the wolf is chained, his later role in Ragnarok is no longer just a possibility. It becomes part of the structure of the myth. In that sense, Fenrir becomes more than a dangerous beast. He is the myth's record of a decision that solved one problem by creating another. Jormungandr is the sea serpent of Ragnarok, the great enemy that lies around the world of human beings. In the surviving Norse sources, especially the prose account preserved by Snorri Sturluson in the 13th century, he is cast into the surrounding ocean and grows so large that he encircles Midgard. That image gives the cosmos a visible boundary. The world is not open-ended. It is ringed by something ancient, dangerous, and alive. The serpent belongs to the same family of threats as Fenrir, but he occupies a different place in the mythic order. Fenrir is a danger tied to captivity and broken trust. Jormungandr is a danger tied to the edge of the world itself. He is often called the Midgard serpent because he lies around the world of human beings, and that placement turns him into more than a monster in the sea. He becomes part of the structure that holds the world together. The sea is not just water in these stories. It is where order meets pressure, where the created world is enclosed by something that can also undo it. That idea fits the shape of Norse cosmology. The gods have their halls, humans have their settled lands, and the giants remain beyond the ordered middle world. Around and below everything else lies distance, darkness, and water. Jormungandr belongs to that outer margin. He is a hostile boundary. The world survives, in part, because its limits have been pushed outward and given a form, but the form is not safe. The serpent is not a wall in the modern sense. He is a living threat that happens to hold the edge in place. The older poetic evidence is shorter and less organized than Snorri's account, but it points in the same direction. In the Poetic Edda, especially in poems connected with Thor, Jormungandr appears as one of the great enemies waiting at the limits of the world. The later prose explains the cosmology more fully, but the essential picture is already there. This is not an ordinary beast encountered in a single place. He is so large and so deeply tied to the world's outer ring that he belongs to the way the world is imagined. He is inside the cosmos and outside ordinary life at the same time. Different retellings stress different parts of that danger. Some focus on the serpent's size and his place in the sea. Others focus on his role at Ragnarok, when he rises from below and joins the final battle. In both versions, the same tension remains. Jormungandr has been cast away, but he has not been destroyed. That is important in Norse myth. The gods often preserve order by pushing danger out of sight, rather than removing it altogether. The present is made stable, but future conflict is built into that stability. This also explains why Jormungandr is so often reared alongside Fenrir. Later tradition especially treats them as paired signs that the god's world is incomplete. They are both children of Loki, and both are treated as threats that cannot be fully contained. Fenrir stands for violence that comes from within the social world. Jormungandr stands for violence that surrounds the world from beneath and around. One belongs to captivity, the other belongs to enclosure. Together they show that the Norse cosmos is not protected by firm walls. It is held together under strain. Snorri's prose gives this placement a clear narrative history. Odin takes Loki's children and separates them because the gods see danger in them before that danger fully arrives. Fenrir is bound. Jormungandr is thrown into the sea. That sequence does more than explain where the serpent came from. It turns him into a consequence of divine fear. The gods act first, and the monster's scale is part of what follows. What is expelled does not vanish. It grows in the region where the gods can no longer easily reach it. In that sense, Jormungandr is a myth about distance as much as he is a myth about destruction. The serpent is not yet the end of the story. In the mythic sequence, Jormungandr still lies where the gods placed him, coiled around the world in a tense stillness. But that stillness is never complete peace. It is a warning held in reserve. Among the best-known Norse stories, Baldr's death is the moment when the future stops feeling abstract. He is a son of Odin and Frigg, and in later retellings he becomes one of the most beloved gods in the whole tradition. That status matters, because the myth depends on the contrast between his apparent safety and the certainty that he will not remain safe for long. The fullest surviving version appears in the prose Edda of the 13th century, written by Snorri Sturluson and drawing on older poetic material. Baldr begins to dream of danger. In the mythic logic of these stories, dreams are warnings, not random thoughts. The gods take them seriously. Frigg responds by traveling through the world and taking oaths from nearly everything in existence, asking fire, water, metal, stone, disease, animals, and other forces not to harm her son. This is one of the clearest examples in Norse myth of protection built through binding and consent. Frigg does not shield Baldr by force. She secures promises from the world itself. The idea is that order can be maintained only if countless things remain in agreement. But the protection is incomplete. In the surviving version, Frigg overlooks mistletoe, usually described as too young or too insignificant to seem dangerous. That detail is small, but it carries the whole myth, because the weakness is not in the forces she consulted. It is in the assumption that something so slight could be ignored. The gods then test Baldr's invulnerability for sport. They throw weapons and objects at him, and everything refuses to hurt him. What looks like proof of divine security is also a public display of how fragile that security really is. The gods are watching a world that seems to obey a single promise, while the story quietly prepares the one exception that will undo it. The ritual of throwing things becomes a demonstration that fate can be delayed only until the hidden flaw is found. At this point, the tradition begins to vary in emphasis. In the prose Edda, Loki is central to the breach. He learns what Frigg has done and uses that knowledge to find the one thing not sworn away from Baldr. In some understandings, Loki acts out of malice, but the older material does not always explain his motive in a single clear line. What the story does make plain is that he turns an almost universal protection into a fatal loophole. He presents the mistletoe to Hoder, Baldr's blind brother, and guides the throw that kills Baldr. This is not a battle between equal enemies. It is an arranged vulnerability carried out through trust, blindness, and a weapon no one expected to matter. Hoder's role deserves careful handling, because later tradition often treats him as a tragic instrument rather than a deliberate murderer. In the poetic sources, he is blind, and that blindness is part of the pathos of the story. He cannot see what he is being made to do. In the prose Edda, the blow is accidental, only in a limited sense. Hoder is manipulated, but the result is still the death of Baldr. The myth treats that death as a rupture in the moral center of the divine world. A god associated with fairness and brightness is lost through a failure of sight and warning. The injury is not only physical, it is also a failure of recognition. Some versions place even more weight on the grief that follows. The gods are not merely losing a warrior or ruler, they are losing a figure associated with radiance, goodness, and peace. That is why Baldr's death has often been read as more than one more conflict among gods. It is the first clear sign that the system can fail from within. Frigg's protections were impressive, but not complete. The bonds among the gods are not enough to close every gap. The death, therefore, has a political meaning as well as a symbolic one. If even the best-loved god can be brought down by a missed exception, then no order is fully secure. An older poem, Baldr's Drama, already assumes Baldr's death as a foregone outcome and focuses on the fear surrounding it. There, Odin's inquiries into Baldr's dreams show that the gods already know the threat is real. The mood is not suspense in the modern sense, it is recognition. Everyone is moving toward a loss that cannot be prevented, only delayed or explained. That matters for the chronology of Ragnarok, because the warning comes before the wider collapse. The death does not start the end by itself, but it reveals the condition that makes the end possible, a world in which knowledge arrives too late, and warning cannot fully change the course of events. Later sources and retellings preserve the sense that Baldr's death is not an isolated family tragedy, but a cosmological marker. The omens point to a larger break in time. In some traditions, grief over Baldr leads directly into attempts to recover him or avenge him, and those efforts only deepen the sense that fate has already begun to harden. The point is not simply that something bad happens to a god, it is that one of the clearest signs of divine vulnerability appears before Ragnarok itself. The future is no longer distant because the gods have already received its first warning. That is why Baldr's warnings matter so much in the larger structure of Ragnarok. Baldr's death is one of the best-known episodes in Norse myth, but the surviving sources do not preserve it in exactly the same way. The broad outline is stable. Baldr, the son of Odin and Frigg, is killed through Loki's actions, and his death becomes one of the major turning points on the road to Ragnarok. The details come through poems and prose retellings that differ in emphasis, order, and motive. Some stress, grief, and the rupture among the gods. Others focus on Loki's deception or on the sense that Baldr's fate was already drawing near long before the killing itself. In the fullest surviving prose account, in Snorri Sturluson's Prose Edda, Baldr begins dreaming of his own death. Frigg, trying to protect him, takes oaths from nearly everything in creation not to harm him. Weapons, stones, diseases, animals, and other forces all promise to leave him untouched. This creates the familiar image of Baldr as nearly invulnerable, and it also makes his later death feel like a breach in a carefully arranged order. The gods come to treat Baldr's safety as something like a game. They throw objects at him in the hall, and he remains unharmed. That detail matters because it shows how the myth works on more than one level. On the surface, Baldr is protected. In the deeper logic of the story, protection has already become a sign of danger. The more completely Frigg secures him, the more attention the myth draws to the one thing she did not include. In Snorri's version, that omission is mistletoe. Loki discovers it, shapes it into a missile, and gives it to Hodr, Baldr's blind brother, who is standing apart from the others. Hodr throws it, and Baldr falls dead. The importance of mistletoe is easy to miss if the story is reduced to a simple trick, but in the mythology, it serves a practical role. It is small, overlooked, and not part of the set of things that seem dangerous. The episode depends on that overlooked exception. What should have been harmless becomes fatal because the protection was never total. That is the version most readers know, but it is not the only one. The older poetic material is more fragmentary. In Baldr's Drama, Baldr's death is not narrated as a scene of trickery at all. It is already assumed. The poem follows Odin's journey into the underworld, where he questions a dead seeress about the meaning of Baldr's dreams. The answer is that Bald is doomed and that the gods cannot reverse what is coming. The poem does not describe the murder in detail, but it confirms that Baldr's death belonged to the older mythic framework well before Snorri wrote his prose account in the 13th century. It also shows that the death was tied to foreknowledge. The gods do not simply lose Baldr by accident. They have been warned, and that warning gives the story its bleak shape. The poetic Edda preserves another important version in Völuspá. There, the killing of Baldr is mentioned as one of the disasters leading toward Ragnarok, and the tone is compressed and prophetic. The emphasis is not on the mechanics of the murder, but on its place in the sequence of doom. Baldr's death stands beside other signs that the world is coming apart from within. That is one reason it is so central to the mythic narrative. It is not just a tragic event, it is proof that the gods can be wounded in the place they thought was safest. In a culture where honor, kinship, and visible strength mattered, the idea that the brightest of the gods could be taken through a hidden flaw carries particular force. The world is not only ending by force from outside, it is failing in trust and knowledge from within the divine order. Loki's role becomes more complicated when the sources are compared. In Snorri's telling, he clearly acts as the deceiver who turns hidden weakness into fatal action. In other traditions, his role is less direct or not described at the same length, but the direction of the story remains consistent. Loki is the figure who exposes hidden fractures. He is not the cause of every disaster in a simple sense, but he is repeatedly linked to disruption, missed boundaries, and knowledge that arrives too late to help. In Baldr's death, that means he is less a random villain than the agent who makes fate visible. He turns an unseen vulnerability into a public catastrophe. Hodra's role is also important. The myth does not present him as a rival with a personal motive in the ordinary sense. He is blind, and that blindness leaves him open to manipulation. The tragedy depends on that vulnerability. The killing is not a battle between equals, it is a betrayal within the divine household, carried out under the appearance of play. That is what makes it so terrible in the mythic imagination. The gods are not defeated by an outside army here. They are undone by one of their own, through a fault in judgment and a use of hidden knowledge. The fact that the act happens in a social setting, with the gods testing Baldr's invulnerability for amusement, makes the loss even sharper. What begins as a sign of safety ends as the moment that safety is disproved. After Baldr dies, the mood of the myths changes sharply. His body is prepared for funeral rites, and the grief of the gods becomes part of the story. Snorri describes the great ship Hringhorni being used for Baldr's funeral, with the gods gathered in mourning. This is one of the few places in Norse material where divine sorrow is given such full attention. It does not erase the coming catastrophe, it deepens it. Baldr's death becomes the emotional proof that the system has begun to fail. The gods are still powerful, but they are no longer intact. Their ritual response matters because it shows that this is not just the loss of one figure. It is the first major crack in the divine order that everyone can see. That is why Baldr's death belongs so directly to the road toward Ragnarok. It is not yet the final war. No armies have gathered on the horizon. Hermod's ride begins with Baldr already dead. In Snorri Sturluson's Prose Edda, Odin sends Hermod to Hel to ask whether the gods can recover Baldr from the realm of the dead. The timing matters. The old order has not yet collapsed, but the gods are already reduced to petitioners. They still act, but their power no longer reaches far enough to undo what has happened. The story comes after the murder and before the final destruction, and that placement gives it a cold clarity. The gods remain organized enough to send an envoy, but not strong enough to command events. Hermod takes Sleipnir, Odin's eight-legged horse, and rides for 9 nights through dark valleys and across empty ground until he reaches Hel's Hall. That journey is part of the meaning. In Norse material, travel to the dead is rarely easy or casual. It marks the boundary between the living and the place where the dead are kept apart. 9 nights feels ritualized rather than merely practical, and Sleipnir matters as well. He is not an ordinary mount but a divine one, suited to crossing thresholds no human rider could manage. Hermod's arrival is not a rescue by force. It is an approach made possible only through Odin's own household and means. There he finds Baldr seated in honor. That detail is important because Hel is not always imagined as a place of torment. In Snorri's version, it is the realm of the dead, and Baldr is received with formal dignity. He is not suffering punishment in this scene. He is given a place of status within death itself. That dignity sharpens the loss. Baldr is not missing in chaos, he is absent in order. He remains a god among the dead, and that is precisely the problem, because the order of the dead cannot replace the order of the living. Snorri presents a world in which death has structure and law, and that law cannot simply be overruled. Hermod asks for Baldr's release. Hel answers with a condition. If every being in the world weeps for Baldr, then he may return. If even one refuses, he must remain in Hel. The bargain turns the rescue into a test of the whole created order. The gods are not only trying to reclaim their own, they must secure the ascent of everything that exists. The story treats grief as universal, extending beyond gods and humans to animals, stones, and soil. That breadth is part of its force. Baldr's death is not a private loss within the family of the gods. It has spread through the whole world, and the attempt to reverse it must reach the whole world as well. The condition also shows how limited the gods have become. They can send a messenger, but they cannot compel the dead to release him. Hel does not bargain from weakness. She sets a term that sounds fair and impossible at once. If all things mourn, the bond may be broken. If one thing withholds grief, it remains. The story never explains why this rule governs Baldr's return, and later tradition does not resolve that uncertainty. In mythic terms, though, the demand fits the scale of the loss. If Baldr truly belongs to the community of the living, then the world itself must testify to it. The rescue depends on total recognition. That is what makes the failure so decisive. The gods send messengers out, and all things weep for Baldr except one giantess named Thok. In Snorri's account, her refusal breaks the condition and ends the attempt to bring Baldr home. Later tradition often identifies Thok as Loki in disguise, but Snorri names only Thok, and that difference matters. The source preserves uncertainty even as it makes the outcome clear. One figure refuses to mourn, and because of that refusal, Baldr stays in hell. The myth leaves open whether the refusal comes from a known enemy hidden in another shape, or from a more anonymous final obstacle. What does not remain open is the result. The world almost completes the mourning, but almost is not enough. The same broad story appears in the poetic Edda, though not always in the same sequence or with the same emphasis. The poems preserve Baldr's death, the grief that follows, and the failed attempt to recover him, while Snorri gives the clearest prose account of Hermod's mission. Across both traditions, the point stays the same. The gods cannot restore Baldr by will alone. The myth does not treat the failure as a misunderstanding that can be corrected later. It presents it as a limit. The prose account explains the mechanism of that limit, while the poems preserve its emotional weight. Together, they show that Baldr's absence was remembered not as a temporary setback, but as a defining break. That limit becomes one of the central meanings of the road toward Ragnarok. Baldr is not only a god who dies, his death shows that the world cannot simply be repaired by divine effort. The rescue fails, and the failure turns loss into something permanent. The gods still have memory, weapons, and allies, but they no longer have a clear path to undo the breach that has opened among them. In that sense, the journey to hell is more than an errand after a funeral. It is a demonstration that divine authority has boundaries. The gods can seek, plead, and witness, but they cannot force death to return what it has taken when the conditions of return are not met. Hermod's journey is therefore not a minor episode before the end. It is the moment when hope is tested and found incomplete. Odin sends an envoy. Hel sets a condition. What happens next in the myth is not a battlefield victory, but a punishment that turns Loki from a disruptive companion into an open enemy. The surviving sources do not present it in exactly the same order, and the shape of the episode depends on whether one is reading the poetic Edda, Snorri Sturluson's prose Edda, or later retellings that smooth the transitions. The broad outline, though, is consistent. After Baldr's death, the gods no longer treat Loki as merely troublesome. They capture him, and from that point on he belongs to the side of ruin. In Snorri's account, Loki flees after Baldr's killing by taking the shape of a fish and hiding in a waterfall. The gods pursue him and eventually catch him. That detail matters because it preserves a familiar feature of Loki's character. He is not only clever, but difficult to pin down, always slipping into another form. His capture marks a real break. For once, the gods manage to impose order on him. They do not reconcile with him. They restrain him. In the logic of the myth, that matters as much as any formal judgment. Loki has moved from a figure who can still argue, joke, and maneuver within the divine household to one who must be physically secured. The punishment itself is severe. Loki is taken to a remote place beneath the world and bound with the entrails of one of his sons. The use of a child's body in the binding is one of the harshest features of the later prose tradition, and it turns betrayal inward. Loki has helped bring about the damage that now falls back on his own family. Above him, a serpent is fastened so that venom drips onto his face. His wife Sigyn stays with him and holds a bowl to catch the poison. When she must empty it, the venom falls on Loki, and his twisting in pain is said to shake the earth. That image belongs most clearly to Snorri's version, which gives the fullest account of the punishment. The earlier poetic evidence is less explicit, but it points in the same direction. Loki is chained, shamed, and set apart before the end. There is also uncertainty about which son is involved. Snorri names the boy Nari or Nafi, and elsewhere another son, Vali, is linked to the binding. The traditions do not fit neatly together, and scholars usually take that as a sign that more than one story has been drawn into the later prose account. What remains constant is the function of the detail. Loki's punishment is not simple imprisonment. It is a family catastrophe turned into cosmic retribution. His household, already fractured by Baldr's death and the collapse of trust among the gods, becomes the instrument of his restraint. The myth makes the point in a hard way. The consequences of treachery do not stop with the traitor alone. This episode also shows something important about Norse myth more generally. The gods do not remove the danger by destroying it outright. They contain it. Loki is tied down, but he is still alive. He does not disappear from the mythic world. His suffering continues, and so does the threat he represents. That is one reason the story fits so naturally on the road toward Ragnarok. Loki is not defeated in the sense of being erased. He is placed out of reach while still remaining part of the structure that will later break. In that sense, his punishment feels less like an ending than a pause. The world has not solved the problem it faces, it has only locked it away. The setting of the punishment matters as well. Snorri places it in a desolate, underground or rocky place, far from ordinary human space. The gods are not staging a public execution or a formal sacrifice in the open. They are sealing Loki away at the edge of the world, in a place of exile and containment. The myth does not preserve a legal procedure in any strict sense, but it does show collective action. The gods act together, and the punishment resembles a grim judgment carried out by a divine community that has finally decided it can no longer tolerate him. Even so, the punishment remains incomplete. Loki is bound, but not transformed. He suffers, but he is not redeemed. Sigin's presence gives the scene its lasting human shape. Her loyalty becomes part of the punishment, and it is one of the few notes of endurance in the whole episode. She does not free Loki, and the sources do not suggest that she can, but she remains. In later tradition, that quiet act of holding the bowl gives this scene its rhythm. Loki's pain is not constant only because of the serpent, it is interrupted and renewed as Sigyn empties the vessel. The earth-shaking that follows belongs to that pattern. It is not random torment, but a repeated cycle built into the punishment itself. Even where the sources differ in detail, they agree that Loki's suffering is ongoing, not a single finished blow. After Baldr is lost and Loki is bound, the Ragnarok stories shift from isolated episodes of divine conflict into a sequence of omens. In the surviving Norse sources, especially the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda, the end of the gods does not arrive all at once. It builds through signs that the old order is failing from within. The warning is not only that enemies are near, it is that the bonds holding the world together are already weakening. The myths link that breakdown among the gods with breakdown among human beings. Brothers turn against brothers, oaths lose their force, betrayal and murder become more common. In the logic of the tradition, these are not separate crises. Human society and the cosmos fail at the same time. When sworn agreements can no longer be trusted, the larger order of the world is also moving toward collapse. That connection fits older Germanic emphases on honor, kinship, and reciprocity, where a broken oath was not merely a private fault, but a threat to social stability itself. In Ragnarok, that social breakdown is widened until it becomes a sign of cosmic disorder. The best-known sign is Fimbulwinter, the great winter that comes before Ragnarok. In the Poetic Edda, it is described as a long season of bitter cold, with no true summer between winters. Snow blows from every direction, and hard weather becomes the normal condition of life. The image matters because it is more than extreme climate. It is the breaking of the seasonal rhythm that makes survival possible. Harvests fail, people struggle to endure. Later readers sometimes treated Fimbulwinter as a remembered memory of severe weather, but in the myth itself it functions as a sign that the world has lost its regular pattern. The seasons no longer behave as they should, and that failure reaches beyond weather. A world that no longer turns in its proper order is already half unmade. That same sense of disrupted order appears in the sky. The sun and moon are threatened. Wolves pursue the heavenly lights. The heavens no longer feel secure. In these stories, the gods have ruled, but their rule has never been permanent in the sense of being beyond change. The world was always moving toward a limit. Ragnarok is the moment when that limit becomes visible. What had been contained begins to break loose. The celestial imagery matters because the sun and moon were not abstract symbols in a lived society. They marked time, seasonal labor, travel, and ritual. When the myths imagine these lights under threat, they are describing the collapse of the structure by which life itself is measured. Loki's punishment makes that expectation sharper rather than closing it down. Even after he is bound, the myths keep him active as a force of disorder. In some traditions, he is directly tied to the chain of events that leads to the final battle. He is no longer only the trickster of earlier tales. He becomes the figure through whom betrayal hardens into open hostility against the gods. That change matters because it marks a point where mischief is no longer temporary disruption. It becomes a fixed alignment with destruction. The binding scene in the sources does not remove Loki from the narrative in any complete sense. Instead, it gives him a new role in the developing catastrophe. The punishment shows that the gods can restrain him, but it also implies that they cannot erase what he has set in motion. The same pattern holds for the beings connected to him. Fenrir remains restrained, but the stories never let the reader forget that his violence has only been delayed. Jormungandr still circles the world. Hel still holds the dead. These figures are not decorative monsters placed around the margins of the gods' world. Each one marks a boundary the gods cannot fully master. The wolf, the serpent, and the ruler of the dead belong to regions of existence that divine order can contain for a time, but never permanently absorb. As Ragnarok approaches, those boundaries become active pressures rather than distant limit. Fenrir's captivity is not a solution, but a pause. Jormungandr's presence around the world sea gives the myth a shape of enclosure that is always under strain. Hel's realm remains separate, but the dead are no longer simply distant. They are part of the same widening tension that presses on the living world. That is why the final war is already present before any battle begins. The omens are many, but they all point in the same direction: broken trust, unending winter, kin set against kin, the dead no longer kept safely apart from the living, and enemies waiting at the edges of the world. The story keeps returning to the same idea. Among the gods, Heimdall is the one most often placed at the threshold. The surviving myths make him a watcher, a guardian, and a sentinel whose task is not to rule but to notice. He stands where Asgard must be defended, and his importance comes from vigilance rather than force. In the poems and prose retellings that survive, he is linked with extraordinary sight and hearing. Later tradition gives him 9 mothers, though the meaning of that detail is uncertain, and scholars have offered different explanations. What matters in the story is the same in every version. Heimdall is the god least likely to be caught unawares. That role fits the kind of cosmos the Norse sources imagine. Ragnarok is not a sudden accident that arrives from nowhere. It is the final consequence of a world that has long lived with enemies at its edges. A guardian like Heimdall belongs to that structure. He watches the boundary because the boundary can fail. He listens because the first sign of disaster may be sound rather than sight. In later retellings, especially Snorri Sturluson's Prose Edda, Heimdall's task becomes more formalized. He guards the god's bridge, Bifrost, and he is associated with the horn Gelahorn, which will be blown when the end begins. The poetic Edda presents the same basic idea in a less systematic way, but the function remains consistent. Heimdall is the one who announces what cannot be held back. That announcement matters because Ragnarok is not only about violence, it is about recognition. The myths repeatedly show that the gods know their enemies exist and they know that the enemies will eventually move. Heimdall embodies that knowledge in active form. He does not prevent the end. The sources never suggest that he can. Instead, he marks the moment when waiting stops and consequence begins. When he sounds the horn, the last distance between warning and event disappears. His own place in the mythic family is unusual as well. Some traditions connect Heimdall with the human world through the poem Rígstula, where a figure named Rig fathers social classes among humans. Later readers sometimes identified Rig with Heimdall, though the relationship is not fully settled and may reflect an interpretive link rather than a fixed original identity. Even so, the connection is suggestive. Heimdall is not only a watcher of gods, he is also a figure who stands near the ordering of human society itself. That makes him an appropriate herald for the end of an age. When the structure of the world breaks down, the one who has guarded its order is also the one who must declare that order finished. The horn he carries becomes one of the most durable symbols in the Ragnarok cycle. Gjallarhorn is not merely an instrument of alarm, it is a sign that the final conflict will be public, heard by gods and enemies alike. The world will not end in secrecy. The warning itself is part of the story. This is one reason Heimdall's role is so important, even though he is not among the most elaborate figures in the mythology. He is there at the moment the narrative turns from unease to mobilization. The defenders of Asgard are awakened not by speculation, but by a call they cannot mistake. The sources also place Heimdall in tension with Loki, and that opposition is important for the larger shape of the myth. Loki is the figure of instability, deception, and broken trust. Heimdall is the figure of alertness, boundary keeping, and notification. They do not simply represent good and evil in a modern sense, but they do stand at opposite poles of order and disruption. In some later traditions, especially in Snorri's account, they are destined to meet again at Ragnarok and kill one another. That duel is not described in as much detail as the deaths of Thor or Odin, but its logic is clear. The Watcher and the Trickster are linked from the beginning by conflict, and the end of the world gives that conflict its final form. Heimdall's watch also reveals something practical about how the old stories imagine catastrophe. There is no long period of uncertainty once the signal comes. The horn is the last notice before the armies gather, before the gods ride out, before the bridge breaks and the forces of destruction move into open battle. In that sense, Heimdall belongs to the brief interval between hidden danger and public disaster. He is the one who keeps that interval as small as possible. The myths preserve him at the edge of action because that is where action first becomes unavoidable. That call also signals that the gods understand what is coming. Once Heimdall sounds the warning, the mythic world is no longer waiting in uncertainty. The boundary lines begin to fill with enemies. In the surviving Norse sources, Ragnarok is never just a single duel or a private revenge story. It is a mass movement of hostile powers from beyond the settled order, and that is what makes it feel so large. The gods are not facing one rival, they are facing a collapse in which many of the world's excluded forces finally move together. The first of those forces are the giants, or Jotnar, who have always stood outside the divine household, even when they are related to it by blood or marriage. In the myths, they are not simply monsters in the modern sense. They are older powers, adversaries, and in some cases necessary counterparts to the gods. But at Ragnarok, that tension hardens into war. Several of the most dangerous figures associated with the end are tied to giant kinship or giant realms, and the final battle draws on that long opposition. The surviving poems and prose retellings are selective, not complete, but they agree on the basic point: the borders of the world open, and from those borders come the powers that have been waiting outside the gods' control. The dead also matter here, and not only as a vague host of the departed. Norse myth places the dead in different destinations depending on how they died and which tradition is being followed. Some go to Valhalla, some to other halls, and many belong to Hel's domain, the underworld ruled by Loki's daughter in later literary sources. At Ragnarok, the dead are not all described in the same way, but the effect is consistent. The world of the living is no longer sealed off from the realm beneath it. The underworld becomes a source of movement, a place from which the enemy side can draw strength. That is one reason the final conflict feels cosmic rather than merely political. The war is not only about who rules the surface. It is about whether the realms themselves can remain distinct. A ship also figures in the approach to the last battle. In the surviving texts, it is made from the nails of the dead, a grim detail that reflects the old fear that neglected burial customs could feed disaster. Later retellings often call it Naglfar. The exact chain of events varies, but the image is steady. The hostile powers are not arriving on foot alone. They are coming by sea, across the broken limits of the world. In a mythic landscape where sea, sky, and underworld each have their own boundaries, that matters. The final war is not only an invasion, it is a breach. Among the most important figures on the enemy side is Loki, whose position is complicated enough that later readers often flatten it into simple villainy. The older material does not do that. Loki is a trickster, a helper, a problem maker, and in some scenes a companion of the gods. But by the time of Ragnarok, he stands with the opposing powers. In the best-known versions, he leads or joins the force that comes against Asgard. He is not merely an individual enemy. He shows that the divine order has lost one of the beings it once kept inside its own circle. That is why his role matters so much. He embodies betrayal from within, but also the fact that the gods' world has always contained instability. The poems do not present this gathering as a sudden surprise. It is the consequence of earlier fractures. Fenrir is bound but not destroyed. Jormungandr lies in the sea but does not vanish. Baldr is dead and remains absent. Loki is punished but not erased. Each of these figures belongs to the build-up toward the end, and the hostile host at Ragnarok is the point where those separate tensions converge. What had once been contained in different places now moves at the same time. The enemies are no longer scattered threats. They are an assembled force. That assembly also includes the fire being Surt, who comes from the south in the most influential versions. Here again, the sources agree on the broad function even when details differ. Surt is not a mortal king or a random warlord. He is an elemental power associated with fire and the destruction that follows it. In some accounts, he stands with the forces of Muspel, a region or people of heat and ruin whose precise shape is not always clear in surviving material. Whatever the exact genealogy, his presence shows that Ragnarok is not simply a feud among gods and giants. It is a convergence of the world's most threatening edges. That is why the final enemy host feels so difficult to stop. It is not one army in one place. It is a convergence of powers that have always belonged to the margins of the cosmos. Giants, the dead, Loki, seaborne danger, and fire all move at once. The gods are not being challenged by a rival court. They are being surrounded by what the old order had kept apart. In the poetic Edda, especially in the vision preserved in Völuspá, this gathering is part of a larger sequence of signs that unfold before the battle itself. The sun grows dark, the stars seem to disappear, and the usual order of time loses its stability. The sources do not treat these details as separate disasters. They belong to the same crisis. If Heimdall's horn announces the approach of enemies, the changes in the sky announce that the world's structure is coming undone at the same time. Ragnarok is never only a military event. It is also a breakdown in the conditions that make the world recognizable. The Old Norse material also suggests that this hostile movement has ritual and social meaning, not just a mythic one. Burial, honor, and proper boundaries between the living and the dead mattered in the world that produced these stories. The image of a ship made from the nails of the dead is unsettling because it turns neglect into consequence. What should have been buried properly becomes part of the end. Later Christian writers preserved the myth, but they did so in a changed world, and some of the language around death, judgment, and final battle may have been shaped by that setting. Even so, the basic idea is older and more native to the tradition. When the dead are not kept in their place, they return as disorder. The same pattern appears in the treatment of Loki and his children. They are not simple additions to the end. They are payoffs to long stories that have already shown what happens when cosmic bonds are strained. Fenrir's binding belongs to a chain of events in which the gods try to prevent a threat and only delay it. Jormungandr is pushed out into the sea, where it encircles the world rather than disappearing from it. Baldr's death marks a wound that is not healed before the end arrives. The enemy host at Ragnarok is therefore not random. It is the moment when old containment measures fail. Surt's place among the attackers shows the same pattern from another angle. Fire, sea, underworld, and wilderness converge. In some later retellings, the forces of Muspel are described as riding or marching behind him, but the precise details are less stable than the role he plays. He stands opposite the gods' ordered hall. He brings heat that cannot be governed, a force that does not negotiate. In a culture that lived with fire as both necessity and threat, that image would have carried real force. The end is not only violent. Ragnarok begins with the breaking of the boundaries that once kept the world in order. In the surviving Norse sources, especially the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda, the end does not arrive as a single sudden disaster. It comes when the divisions between realms stop holding. Asgard is no longer safely apart from the world of the giants. Midgard is no longer secure behind its protections. The dead, the fire, the sea, and the powers at the edges of the cosmos all begin to move inward at once. This is why the story unfolds as a chain of breaches rather than one final blow. It is not only a battle scene, it is the collapse of the arrangement that made battle, settlement, and protection meaningful in the first place. The surviving texts do not always describe that collapse in the same way. The Poetic Edda preserves older mythic material in poetic form, while the Prose Edda, written by Snorri Sturluson in the 13th century, gathers and explains many traditions for an audience already far removed from the pagan period. Later retellings often smooth the sequence, but the older material tends to emphasize signs, movements, and breaches rather than a single decisive trigger. The point is not merely that something terrible happens. The point is that the world stops behaving like a world with fixed borders. One of the clearest signs of that collapse is Naglfar, the ship said in the Prose Edda to be made from the nails of the dead. The detail is strange, but it is carefully chosen. The dead are not simply gone from the world. Their remains become part of the force that carries the enemies of the gods into the final war. Naglfar is not a normal vessel, and it does not belong to the human world of craft and settlement. It belongs to a place where burial no longer guarantees rest. In that sense, the ship turns one of the ordinary facts of death into a sign of cosmic violation. What should stay separated is combined. What should remain still is set in motion. The enemy's approach matters because it comes from the margins. Some sources place the giants coming from the east, others from the north, but the direction is less important than the idea behind it. The gods are threatened by what has always stood outside the settled center. These beings are not only strangers in a political sense, they are tied to the older edge of creation, to regions that the gods have never fully subdued. When they gather, the old map of the cosmos begins to fail. This is not just an army crossing a border, it is the return of the untamed exterior into the ordered interior. That pattern appears in the role of Loki as well, though the sources handle him in different ways. In some poems and in Snorri's account, he is bound until the end, then released to stand among the powers that oppose the gods. His presence matters because he is a figure of crossing and instability. He belongs to the gods but never quite fits among them. He moves between categories, and at Ragnarok that in-between quality becomes destructive rather than clever or disruptive. The texts do not explain him in a modern psychological sense. They present him as part of the failure of order itself. Fire breaks its boundary too. Surt, the fire giant or fire being of the final conflict, comes from Muspel, a place or power associated with heat and destruction in fragmentary surviving traditions. The texts do not agree on every detail of Muspel, but they consistently connect it with ruinous flame. At Ragnarok, that fire does not remain in its own domain. It moves inward. The force that was once held at the edge of the world crosses into the world of the gods and makes everything vulnerable to burning. In some versions, Surt's advance is tied directly to the final destruction of the world by fire, which shows that the last phase of the catastrophe is not only military defeat but elemental collapse. Cold and frost also enter the breakdown. In Norse myth, creation itself often begins in the meeting of heat and ice, a tension that helps shape the world at the end. That balance is not restored but reversed. The cold no longer functions as a background condition. It becomes another sign that the cosmos is losing its order. Fire and frost do not stay in separate places. Both press toward the center, and neither remains safely contained. The older cosmology depends on difference: land from sea, inside from outside, heat from cold, life from death. Ragnarok shows what happens when those differences no longer hold. The sea loses its restraint too. Jormungandr, the world serpent, already marks the outer edge of the habitable world by circling it. In the final battle, as described in the Poetic Edda and Prose Edda, it rises from the sea and brings poison and destruction with it. That image is important because the serpent is both boundary and threat. While it encircles the world, it defines its limits. When it rises, the limit itself becomes dangerous. The sea that once enclosed the world releases what it held. The older myths often imagine danger as something that lives beyond the human center, and Jormungandr is one of the clearest examples of that idea becoming active at the end. Heimdall's horn, Gjallarhorn, fits the same pattern. It is not only an alarm, it marks the moment when warning ends and open conflict begins. Once it sounds, concealment is over. The gods can no longer treat the threat as distant or incomplete. The old stories do not present Ragnarok as a surprise in the ordinary sense. They present it as the final arrival of what has already been foretold. The horn signals that every danger is now moving at once. In some traditions, Heimdall himself is the watcher stationed at the edge, which makes the horn especially fitting. The boundary guardian is the one who announces that the boundary has failed. Some passages also suggest that the sky itself loses its order. The sun darkens. The stars disappear. The heavens no longer feel stable or reliable. These details do not appear in exactly the same form in every source, but the larger picture is steady. The world is not only being attacked, it is being undone from the edges inward. Above and below, inside and outside, living and dead, secure and unstable, all begin to collapse together. That convergence gives the opening stage of Ragnarok its force. The crisis is already total before the fighting fully unfolds. That is why the breaking of boundaries is so central to the story of Ragnarok. The final war is not just one army fighting another. Ragnarok is defined by a set of final encounters, and the surviving sources make those encounters concrete. Once the horn sounds and the world begins to fail, the end of the old order unfolds as a chain of confrontations. The Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda agree on the broad outline, though they do not always preserve the same sequence or emphasis. Even so, the shape of the story is clear. The gods do not meet an abstract force of destruction. They meet specific enemies tied to earlier events, and that is what gives the battle its form. Odin's clash comes first in many retellings. He faces Fenrir, the wolf whose restraint was always temporary. That detail matters because Fenrir is not a sudden arrival at the end. He is the result of earlier fear and earlier attempts by the gods to delay a fate they already knew could not be avoided forever. In the older tradition, the gods had chained him after he became too dangerous to trust. His captivity was never permanent safety. It was a postponement. When Ragnarok comes, the wolf breaks free and meets Odin in open combat. The outcome is not in doubt. Odin is swallowed by Fenrir. In some versions, Odin's son Vidar then avenges him by killing the wolf, but the larger pattern remains the same. The highest god meets the creature that had long been held at bay, and the struggle ends in loss. Thor's battle with Jormungandr is one of the clearest episodes in the cycle. The Midgard's serpent encircles the world, and its hostility to Thor is older than Ragnarok itself. Earlier myths already placed them in direct opposition, including the fishing episode in which Thor nearly pulls the serpent from the sea. That earlier scene matters because it shows the final battle as a continuation rather than an isolated event. At the end, the unfinished conflict reaches its conclusion. Thor kills the serpent, but he is poisoned in the struggle and dies after taking only a short distance. Victory and death arrive together. Norse myth does not present the end of the world as a place where the gods can still secure a lasting triumph. Thor defeats his enemy, but he cannot escape the cost. Freyr's battle has a different tone, but it ends just as decisively. He faces Surt, the fire giant associated with Muspel and the burning destruction that follows the war. In the Prose Edda, Freyr is said to have given away the sword that might once have helped him. That detail fits the myth's own logic. Freyr is not weak. He has simply already parted with the weapon that would have mattered most when the final conflict arrived. Read that way, the story can reflect a fertility god tied to prosperity and the land, only to fall when the world itself is consumed. However the interpretation is handled, the narrative point is clear. Freyr faces Surt and dies, and his death ties the battlefield directly to the fire that will soon overtake it. Other combats complete the scene, even when the surviving texts are less detailed. Tyr meets the hound Garma in some traditions, and both are killed. Heimdall and Loki kill one another, continuing the long opposition between Guardian and Deceiver that has shaped the story from earlier episodes. These are not random pairings added for variety. They are the final form of relationships already established in the myth. Ragnarok does not invent new enemies. It brings old enemies to their last meeting. That is one reason the battle feels so coherent in the sources, even when the descriptions are sparse. The final conflict gathers together rivalries that were already in motion, and each death reads as the completion of a pattern rather than a sudden turn. The battle as a whole is described in stark terms. The gods fight bravely, but bravery is not the same as survival. Snorri's Prose Edda presents the conflict as a formal catastrophe in which each major figure meets the opponent most closely bound to his own story. The poetic Edda, especially Völuspá, gives the battle a more compressed and prophetic shape, but it preserves the same sense that this is not a confused melee. It is a sequence of destined confrontations. The sources do not dwell on tactics or formations. They focus on the identity of the opponents and the certainty of the outcome. That restraint is part of the myth's force. The battle is not about surprise. It is about the fulfillment of relationships that were always moving toward this end. That is what makes this part of Ragnarok so enduring. The gods are not passive victims, they resist. Odin rides to meet Fenrir. Thor strikes down the serpent. Freyr stands against the fire giant. Heimdall and Loki face each other directly. But each act belongs to a world that is already ending. The gods can still meet ruin on their own terms, but they can no longer preserve the order they ruled. Their final struggle has dignity, but it also has limit. By the end of the battle, the cost is plain. The gods have fought, and in some cases they have taken their enemies with them. In the surviving poems, the deaths at Ragnarok are not random losses. They are the final outcomes of relationships already established in the older myths. Odin falls to Fenrir. Thor dies after killing Jormungandr. Freyr is undone by the sword he once gave away. Heimdall and Loki destroy each other, and Tyr faces the hound Garma. The details shift from source to source, but the pattern remains steady. Each figure meets the force most closely tied to his own story, and that gives the battle a bleak order. Odin's death is one of the clearest examples. In the poetic Edda, especially Völuspá, he rides at the head of the gods and is swallowed by Fenrir. The wolf is not a new threat by then. He has long been feared, bound and watched, and the prophecy of his escape makes Odin's final ride feel less like a surprise than the fulfillment of an old danger. The Prose Edda tells the same basic event with more detail. Odin is consumed by the wolf, and then Vidar, Odin's son, avenges him by tearing Fenrir apart. The emphasis is not on rescue, but on consequence. Odin does not survive the knowledge he has gathered. In the mythic logic of Ragnarok, wisdom allows him to foresee the end, but not to avoid it. That matters because Odin is not a passive victim anywhere else in the mythology. He gives up an eye, seeks out prophecy, and shapes the divine order through foresight and planning. At Ragnarok, that same habit of knowing becomes part of the tragedy. The old poems do not present him as ignorant of what is coming. On the contrary, they make the event feel almost formal, as if he is riding toward a conclusion already built into the myths. Odin's power has always been tied to understanding limits, and the limit here is final. Thor's death has a different shape. He is one of the few gods who directly defeats his enemy. He kills Jormungandr after a violent struggle, but he does not walk away from the fight. According to the poems and Snorri's retelling, Thor takes only a few steps before he falls, poisoned by the serpent's venom. The point is important. Thor is not defeated in combat in any ordinary sense. He wins, and still dies. That fits his role throughout the mythology. He is the defender who can strike the great monster, but even his strength belongs to a world that cannot hold itself together. His death is not a failure of courage. It is the cost of the victory he achieves. There is also a broader pattern behind Thor and the serpent. Earlier stories already placed them in opposition, and Ragnarok turns that old enmity into its final form. Jormungandr has circled the world and long represented a threat that cannot be contained forever. Thor has often been the god who meets that threat head-on. So when the two finally destroy each other, the moment feels like the closing of an account that has been opened since the earlier stories were first told. The venom is especially fitting. It suggests that the world's great forces do not simply break against one another, they poison one another. Even victory leaves damage behind. Freyr's death is more tragic in a quieter way. He has already given away his sword in earlier myth, usually in the account of his desire for Gerther. That loss matters at Ragnarok because it leaves him without the weapon he would need against Surt. In the battle, Freyr fights the fire giant and is killed. The old texts do not linger over the details as much as they do with Odin or Thor, but the meaning is clear. Freyr enters the final conflict already weakened by a choice made long before. The myth gives his death irony, but not mockery. It shows how the gods remain tied to earlier actions and cannot simply step outside them when the end comes. This is why Freyr's role in the final battle is often read as a reminder that mythic time is not linear in the modern sense, but it is still consequential. A decision in one story becomes the condition for defeat in another. His lost sword is not just a dramatic detail. It explains why a god associated with prosperity and peace cannot defend himself against the destructive fire at the end. In the preserved tradition, Surt is not merely an enemy for Freyr to oppose. He is the force that exposes the cost of Freyr's earlier surrender. Tyr's death is less fully developed, but the surviving tradition still gives him a place in the final fighting. In the Prose Edda, he faces Garma, the guard dog associated with Hel. Both die. Tyr is already marked by sacrifice, since older myth makes him the god who loses his hand in the Binding of Fenrir. At Ragnarok, he meets another boundary-keeping creature, and the match feels deliberate. He is not the most prominent figure in the later stories, but the old material preserves him as one of the gods who still stands in line when the last battle arrives. Tyr's presence keeps the final battle connected to older ideas of law, binding, and oath. In the myth where he loses his hand, he makes a costly guarantee so that Fenrir can be restrained. That earlier sacrifice already ties him to the wolf's story. At Ragnarok, he faces a different guardian of the boundary world, and the exchange of deaths reinforces the same theme. The divine order cannot simply be enforced without consequence. The gods who uphold it are also the ones most exposed when it fails. Heimdall and Loki matter, especially because they are not only enemies, but opposites in the mythic order. Heimdall is the watcher of the gods, stationed at the edge of their world. Loki is the destabilizer, the figure who has moved from helper to betrayer. In Völuspá, they kill one another. Snorri's version agrees in broad outline, though the exact details are sparse. Their mutual death closes the bridge between warning and disaster. Heimdall has sounded the alarm, but the alarm cannot prevent the war. Loki has helped set the ruin in motion, and at the end he is trapped in the catastrophe he helped create. The pairing has structural importance too. Heimdall belongs to vigilance, boundary, and protection. Loki belongs to breach, deception, and disruption. Their final clash therefore reads less like a random duel and more like the collapse of the system they represent. If Heimdall is the one who sees what is coming, and Loki is one of the powers that makes disaster possible, then their deaths together show that both warning and chaos are consumed in the same end. Loki's death is also tied to punishment, and that punishment comes before the final battle in the sequence of the myths. Different traditions treat him differently, but by the time Ragnarok arrives, he is already a condemned figure. In the battle itself, he dies fighting Heimdall. The poems do not treat him as a side character. He is part of the structure of the end. The order he once stood inside has broken, and by the final conflict, he belongs fully to the forces that destroy it. That is one of the deeper patterns in this section. The deaths are not just about who falls. They are about how each figure is already bound to the shape of his end. Loki crosses from inside to outside. Odin sees enough to know the cost, but not enough to escape it. Thor destroys the enemy he was made to fight and dies in the act. Freya's earlier generosity returns as vulnerability. Tyr's older sacrifice leads into a final confrontation with another guardian of the underworld. Even where the details differ, the mythology keeps returning to the same idea. The end is not arbitrary. It grows out of the story that came before. One striking feature of these deaths is how little the myths emphasize a single surviving victor among the gods. There is bravery and there are acts of revenge, but there is no restoration through combat. Odin's death is answered by Vidar. Thor's killing of the serpent is matched by his own fall. Freyr and Surt destroy each other in effect, though not evenly. Heimdall and Loki perish together. Tyr and Garma do the same. The old world is being measured out in losses, not gains. The sources matter here too. The poetic Edda gives many of these deaths in brief prophetic lines, as if the outcome is already known and does not need much explanation. The Prose Edda, written later in Iceland by Snorri Sturluson, expands the sequence and tries to preserve the order of events in fuller prose. In some places, Snorri may be organizing older material into a cleaner system than the poems themselves always provide, but both traditions agree on the larger point. The gods fall in relation to the enemies most bound to them, and the deaths are part of a pattern the mythology has been building toward for a long time. These are not the only deaths associated with the final struggle, but they are the ones the surviving Norse sources preserve most clearly and most often. The poems do not read like a roster of battlefield casualties. They select the figures that carry the greatest symbolic weight. Odin's fall marks the end of divine kingship. Thor's fall marks the end of the strongest defender. Freya's fall marks the failure of inherited abundance and peace. Heimdall and Loki mark the collapse of boundary and breach together. Tyr marks the last echo of an older sacrificial order. The effect is cumulative. Each death narrows the world further. Ragnarok ends in fire and flood. In the oldest surviving versions, the destruction does not happen all at once. It comes after the great battles have already begun, when the old powers are failing and the shape of the world is already breaking apart. Then Surt appears from the south, tied to Muspelheim, the burning realm at the edge of the Norse cosmos. In some sources he simply brings fire. In Snorri Sturluson's Prose Edda he carries a blazing sword. Either way, his arrival marks the point at which the end can no longer be delayed. The poems and Snorri agree on the basic movement. Surt advances after the main fighting has started, and his fire follows the collapse of the world's boundaries. This is not ordinary battlefield flame. It is a cosmic force that reaches beyond armies and into the structure of the world itself. The halls of the gods, the homes of people, the earth beneath them all belong to the same ordered whole, and that order begins to fail. Fire is what completes the breaking. That matters because the deaths of the gods have already changed everything. Odin is gone, Thor is gone, and Tyr, Freya and Heimdall are gone as well, depending on the version being followed. Once those figures fall, the world is already no longer what it was. Surt's fire does not begin the collapse. It finishes it. In the mythic logic of the sources, the sequence matters more than a literal physical explanation. First, the old defenders are lost. Then the world burns. Then the waters rise. Then the old earth disappears. The sources are not identical in how they present Surt. Some emphasize the sword. Some emphasize the fire itself. Some place him within a broader pattern of destruction rather than giving him a full narrative role. But the shared idea is stable. He belongs to the forces that appear at the end of the world, just as Fenrir belongs to Odin's fate and the Sea Serpent belongs to Thor's final struggle. Surt is not a moral judge who punishes anyone. He is part of the myth's structure of ending, a power whose role is to reduce the old cosmos to ruin. In that sense, he resembles other world destroyers in myth, more than an enemy in a simple war. He is a sign that repair is no longer possible. Muspelheim helps explain why his fire matters so much. In Snorri's cosmology, it is one of the primordial regions of the universe, hot and bright opposed to the cold of the deep. That contrast gives Ragnarok a wider frame. The end of the world is not only a human disaster, or even only a war among gods. It is the return of a primal opposition built into the universe. Fire comes from the south, from outside the ordered middle world, and that direction is important. The Norse cosmos is arranged around boundaries, and the invasion from Muspelheim means those boundaries have failed. After the fire comes the flood. Here too, the texts vary in emphasis, but they converge on the same result. Snorri says the world sinks into the sea. Other passages suggest a cleansing or remaking through water after the burning has passed. The point is not to describe a natural disaster in literal terms. The myth uses the elements themselves to show the end of an age. Fire strips away what remains. Water covers the rest. Between them, almost nothing of the old world survives intact. Destruction does not arrive as chaos alone. It follows a pattern, and that pattern is part of the myth's meaning. This is one reason scholars treat the surviving accounts carefully. The poetic Edda preserves older verse, but the poems were written down in Iceland in the Christian era, and Snorri was composing in a Christian society as well. That does not mean the image of fire and flood is late invention. It does mean the surviving record stands at the meeting point of older myth and later literary shaping. Some language may have been sharpened by Christian ideas of judgment and final destruction. Even so, the story is not a simple copy of biblical apocalypse. The Norse version keeps its own logic, in which the world's end grows out of cosmic balance breaking down, not out of a single divine sentence. The order of fire and flood also matters because Ragnarok is not only about destruction, it is also about what can come after. The old world has to be broken before anything new can take shape. The fire removes the familiar landmarks. It burns the halls, the fields, and the boundaries that once held the cosmos together. Once that is gone, the flood can finish the work. Only then can the story move toward renewal. The surviving sources never let that renewal erase the catastrophe that makes it possible. They keep the ruin in view first. The imagery is concrete, but the function is symbolic as well. A world that once had clear borders is dissolved by the very forces that once lay outside it. That is why Surt matters in the larger structure of the myth. He does not act alone, and he is not the cause of the first collapse. The deaths of the gods have already opened the way, yet he is the figure who makes the ending irreversible. His fire reaches across the ruined order, and the flood follows as the final closing of the old age. After the fire and flood, the surviving traditions do not simply end. They move toward a smaller, quieter future. In the clearest version preserved in the poetic Edda, a renewed world rises, and a few gods who are not named among the dead remain alive to take part in it. The surviving names differ slightly from text to text, but the basic idea stays the same. Ragnarok does not erase every divine presence. It leaves behind a remnant. Among the gods, Vidar and Vali are usually counted among the survivors. They are not central figures in the older surviving myths in the way Odin, Thor, or Freya are, but they matter here because they represent continuity after the old order has fallen. Vidar is often associated with silence and endurance, and in later tradition, he becomes one of the figures who steps into the space left by Odin's death. Vali is also linked with survival, though his role is less developed in the surviving poems. In some accounts, Baldr and Hodder return as well, no longer separated by the tragedy that defined them before the final battle. That detail belongs to the later sequence of rebirth, and it matters because it suggests that the renewed world is not built from strangers. It is built from figures already known to the mythic past. Not every source treats the survivors in exactly the same way. The poetic Edda, especially in Völuspá, gives the broad outline of a world that returns after devastation, while Snorri's prose Edda organizes the material more explicitly and sometimes more systematically. Snorri names the surviving gods and describes them gathering in a place called Idavoll, the same plane where the gods had met in the earlier age. This matters because the renewed world is not a completely different cosmos. It is the old cosmos made habitable again, but under altered conditions. The plane remains, yet the old threats are gone. The surviving gods can meet there because the structures of the world have been remade. In Snorri's account, they also recover and consult the old tokens of power, including the golden game pieces of the gods that had survived from the earlier age. That kind of detail reinforces the sense of inheritance. The new beginning is not blank. It is connected to what came before by memory, place, and recovered signs of order. The human survivors are even fewer in number, and the texts are careful about them. In the most familiar tradition, two people named Lif and Lifthrasir survive by sheltering in the world tree, often understood as Yggdrasil itself or a protected place within it. The prose Edda describes them surviving on morning dew and later repopulating the earth after the destruction. Whether this should be read as a literal world tree refuge in the older poetic material or as Snorri's more developed explanation is debated, but the motif is clear enough. Human life is not ended outright. It is preserved in a hidden form, then brought back into the open when the danger has passed. The use of dew is significant here. It is a modest and almost ordinary image, especially beside the scale of the fire and flood. The survival of the human pair does not come through conquest or divine privilege. It comes through concealment and endurance, which suits the wider shape of the ending. That gives Ragnarok one of its most distinctive features. The end is total enough to destroy a world, but not absolute enough to prevent continuation. This is not a final cosmic erasure. The surviving gods and humans show that the myth imagines transmission across catastrophe. Something endures because the world is ordered to allow endurance, even after collapse. The story keeps that tension in place. It does not soften the losses. Odin is still dead. Thor is gone. The old battle has already taken the great figures, but the renewed plane and the protected human pair keep the future from closing completely. The myth works on two scales at once. On one level, it is a closing of an age. On another, it is a statement that endings in this tradition are rarely simple annihilations. They are breaks in sequence, after which continuity can resume in reduced form. Later retellings often made this section more explicit than the oldest poems do. Christian readers and scribes may have found the language of survival, return, and a cleansed world easier to arrange into a sequence that resembled judgment followed by restoration. Still, the underlying Norse pattern is not merely borrowed from elsewhere. The ending after Ragnarok is not presented as a reward for moral behavior in the later Christian sense. It is presented as the next state of a world that has passed through its allotted destruction. The surviving gods do not cancel the tragedy. They stand on the far side of it. That distinction is important because it keeps the myth rooted in its own worldview. The new age is not a heaven that replaces the old earth. It is the earth renewed, carrying forward what has not been lost. That is why the renewed world matters so much in the structure of the myth. After the sea takes what remains of the old land and the fire has done its work, the story does not leave only emptiness behind. In the surviving Norse poems, the world after Ragnarok is not a return to the old order. It is a renewal shaped by what has been lost. The land rises again from the sea, and the earth is said to become green once more. That detail matters because it shows that the end of the old cosmos is not the end of all possibility. The story leaves room for a future, but not for a simple reversal. What comes back is changed by what came before. The clearest version appears in the Poetic Edda, especially in Völuspá, where the seeress describes a world after fire and flooding. Green fields are mentioned, and the earth is imagined fertile again. The language is brief, but enough to suggest that the land itself survives the violence and begins again. In the prose Edda, Snorri Sturluson expands this idea and gives the renewed world a more orderly shape, with surviving gods returning to Idavol, the plane where the old assemblies once met. That plane becomes a meeting point for the new age, a place where memory and continuity gather after collapse. In the older poems, the emphasis is less on explanation than on a sequence of surviving images: earth, light, water, and the return of life. Snorri turns those images into a more connected narrative, but both versions agree on the main point. The world after Ragnarok is not empty. The surviving gods are part of that continuity. Odin's sons, Vidar and Vali, remain, and Thor's sons, Modi and Magni, are said to survive as well. In some versions, they inherit Thor's hammer, Mjolnir. That detail links the new age to the old one through a weapon that had defended gods and humans alike. The hammer does not erase loss. It carries the memory of old protection into the next world. It also suggests that the qualities associated with Thor do not disappear when he falls. Strength, defense, and the preservation of order continue, but in the hands of a younger generation. Baldr and Hodr are also said to return from hell in the renewed order. This is one of the more delicate parts of the tradition because the poems do not always explain their return in the same way, and Snorri presents the scene more directly than the older material does. Still, the pattern is clear enough. Baldr, whose death marked the deepening of the god's ruin, belongs to the world that follows it. His return gives the new age a different tone from the one that preceded Ragnarok. It is not innocence regained, but restoration after damage has already been done. Baldr's presence also closes one of the most important arcs in the mythic sequence. The death that stood for irreversible loss is not denied, but answered by a return that hints at continuity beyond catastrophe. Hodr's return is equally important, though it is usually treated with less emphasis in modern retellings. Together, the two figures suggest that the renewed world is not only for surviving warriors, it also includes those tied to the tragedy that helped bring the old order to its end. Human survival is handled in a similarly restrained way. The poems say that Lif and Lifthrasir hide through the destruction and emerge afterward to repopulate the earth. Their names are often taken to mean life and persistence, though scholars treat the exact meanings cautiously. What matters is their role. Human life is not extinguished. It is preserved through concealment, then restored when the world can bear it again. That turns Ragnarok into a break in history rather than the final end of existence itself. The pair is said to shelter in a protected place during the catastrophe, which gives the tradition a practical shape as well as a symbolic one. Life endures not through triumph, but through endurance and hiding. In that sense, the myth imagines survival as something small and vulnerable, rather than heroic in the usual sense. The New World also has a different cosmic texture. The surviving texts do not describe it as a judgment in the later Christian sense, with the wicked punished and the righteous rewarded in a final sorting of souls. Instead, the myth presents a cycle of destruction and renewal within a cosmos that still has structure. The old gods are gone or transformed. The old enemies are gone with them. What remains is not innocence, but order rebuilt from the remnants of a shattered system. This is why the renewed world is often read as both hopeful and sober. It does not deny tragedy. It acknowledges that life continues only after ruin. Even the absence of the great gods is part of the new order. Their disappearance is not followed by theological resolution so much as by a redistribution of responsibility to the surviving figures and the restored land. One of the clearest images in the tradition is the appearance of a new sun. In Völuspá, the sun's daughter is said to shine in the place of the old sun. That small detail says a great deal about continuity. Light returns, but not in the same form. The cosmos has been renewed by succession rather than restored exactly as it was. The old sun is gone, and a new source of light takes its place. The same pattern appears throughout the ending of the myth. What survives does so by changing. The world is not rebuilt by undoing the past. It is rebuilt by replacing what was lost with something related, but not identical. A few surviving poems also mention a hall called Gimle, said to be brighter than the sun and to stand after the fire has passed, because the sources are uneven. Here, scholars have long debated whether this reflects an older Norse idea, a later elaboration, or a place shaped by Christian influence in transmission. The safest reading is to treat Gimle as part of the layered afterlife of the myth rather than a simple original detail. Even so, it fits the broader vision of a renewed world where some form of refuge, memory, or lasting order remains possible after catastrophe. What can be said with confidence is that the idea of a shining hall matches the larger pattern of the ending. The myth does not stop at ruin. It points toward a place, however briefly sketched, where something may endure beyond the fire. That is the essential shape of the ending. The old cosmos is not repaired piece by piece. It is replaced by a younger world with surviving gods, surviving people, and a renewed earth. The tale keeps the memory of loss inside the structure of renewal, so the next stage never cancels what came before. It only shows that Ragnarok was never only about destruction. The main sources for Ragnarok come from medieval Iceland, especially the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda. They are not identical, and that difference matters. The poems preserve older material in compressed, often difficult language, while Snorri Sturluson's Prose Edda, written in the 13th century, arranges the myths into a more continuous account. Snorri helps modern readers follow the story, but he is also writing later, after Iceland had been Christian for generations. His version may preserve older tradition, shape it for clarity, or reflect his own literary world. The safest approach is to read the two together rather than treat either one as the final word. That caution matters because neither source gives a single polished epic in the modern sense. What survives is a literary record of material older than the manuscripts in which it appears. The poems were likely preserved in oral circulation before they were written down, and oral tradition does not always keep events in one fixed order. A motif can appear briefly in one poem, then return elsewhere with more detail. A name can be central in one place and absent in another. For Ragnarok, that means the sources preserve the shape of the end without always agreeing on every step inside it. In the Poetic Edda, Ragnarok appears most clearly in poems such as Völuspá and Vafthrûnismál. Völuspá gives the broad sequence: omens, battle, destruction, and renewal. It is brief, but it is the backbone of the myth. Vafthrûnismál preserves some of the same ideas in question and answer form, including the gods who survive and what follows the catastrophe. Other poems add smaller pieces of the picture, but none gives a single complete narrative from start to finish. The myth survives as a set of related fragments, which later readers have had to assemble with care. That fragmentary character is evidence in itself. It suggests that Ragnarok was known as a shared tradition before it became a standard literary summary. Snorri's Prose Edda, especially Gylfaginning, presents a more orderly version. It names the signs, explains the final battle, and follows the deaths of major gods in a clearer sequence. For that reason, many modern retellings depend heavily on Snorri. But the order is partly a literary arrangement. Snorri is not simply copying a single pagan script. He is organizing inherited material into a form that can be taught and remembered. His prose also serves a practical purpose. In the 13th century, he is preserving mythological knowledge at a time when it was already becoming specialized, learned, and retrospective rather than part of everyday religious practice. That also helps explain why some details differ from source to source. Baldr's death, for example, appears in both Eddaic and prose traditions, but Loki's role is not always handled in exactly the same way. In some tellings, Loki directly engineers the killing. In others, the emphasis falls more on the tragic chain of events that follows. The final battle also shifts in small ways from one account to another, including which god meets which enemy and how each death happens. These are not random errors. They are signs that the myth was transmitted orally, then recorded by writers who inherited overlapping, but not perfectly identical versions. A tradition that lived in repeated telling could preserve a stable core while leaving room for local emphasis and poetic choice. The same caution applies to Christian influence. The surviving texts were written down in Christian Iceland, and that alone affects how they should be read. Some scholars think certain features of Ragnarok, especially the strong sense of destruction followed by a renewed world, may have been encouraged by contact with Christian ideas. Others argue that the core of the myth is older, and that the writers simply recorded it in a Christian environment without fundamentally reshaping it. The evidence does not allow a simple answer. What can be said with confidence is that the written versions come to us through a Christian literary setting, even when they preserve material that is clearly not Christian in origin. The manuscripts are later, but they remain the main path by which the older tradition survives. That setting matters most when the ending is discussed. The renewed world, the return of green growth, and the surviving gods fit the shape of a conclusion, but details like Gimle raise questions. The hall is mentioned in the surviving sources, yet the language around it is not as stable as the better-known parts of the myth. It may preserve an older image of refuge, or it may show how later scribes and poets adapted the tradition as they wrote it down. Either way, it belongs to the transmitted version of Ragnarok, not to a reconstructed original that can be recovered with certainty. The same is true of the surviving children of the gods in some versions, and of the idea that a remade world follows destruction. Those elements are part of the literary inheritance we actually have, even when their oldest form cannot be pinned down precisely. Beyond the Eddas, other sources add context rather than a full alternate account. Skaldic poetry can preserve mythic names and allusions, though often in dense language. Because skaldic verse was often composed for courts and patrons, it could preserve older mythological references in a form that assumed prior knowledge. A single phrase may point to an entire story the audience was expected to recognize. Saxo Grammaticus, writing in Latin in Denmark, records related material in a more historicizing form, but his treatment of the gods is shaped by a different agenda and cannot be read as a straightforward parallel to the Norse mythic poems. He is valuable because he shows how learned medieval writers outside Iceland could adapt inherited Scandinavian material into a more classical or moralizing framework. His account is evidence of reception as much as preservation. Together, these sources show that the tradition was wide, flexible, and local as well as shared. The story of the end was not frozen in one fixed text. Different communities could emphasize different gods, different signs, or different outcomes. Some versions foreground the deaths of major figures. Others make more room for survival and renewal. Even the names used for cosmic events can shift depending on the poem or prose retelling. What modern readers call Ragnarok is therefore a synthesis built from several medieval witnesses, each with its own angle and purpose. So the version most readers know is not a single pristine tale handed down unchanged. Ragnarok endured because it answered several questions at once. It explained why even the gods could fail. It gave shape to loss without pretending loss could be avoided. And it preserved a quieter idea as well. Destruction does not always mean absolute ending. In the surviving poems, the old order falls, but a renewed world follows. That pairing is one reason the myth remained meaningful long after the pagan period itself had passed. In the Norse world, fate was not usually presented as something that could be escaped. The myths repeatedly show even the strongest beings as limited by what is already in motion. Odin cannot avoid what the seeress foresees. Thor can fight the world serpent, but not prevent the poison that follows. Baldr's death shows that innocence and divine status do not guarantee safety. Ragnarok gathers those threads into one final pattern. It is not only a battle at the end of time. It is a story about the temporary nature of order and about the limits of every realm, including the divine one. That made the myth useful in both ritual and cultural terms. It gave language to a world where winter, famine, feud, and shipwreck were not abstractions but recurring realities. In that setting, a story of final ruin could also become a way of thinking about endurance. The poems do not promise rescue. They do not say the old world will be preserved intact. Instead, they accept that things break, and they place meaning in what follows. That is a different kind of hope, closer to continuity through change. Ragnarok also fits the wider pattern of Old Norse literature. The surviving corpus often joins grandeur with loss. Heroes act knowing that victory may be temporary and that their effort still matters. The same logic appears in the end of the gods. The point is not that suffering is cancelled, but that honor, memory, and order can survive even when survival itself is impossible. In a society shaped by kinship, obligation, and the management of risk, that idea had practical as well as poetic force. A story could not stop winter or prevent feud, but it could give people a way to speak about those realities without silence. The surviving texts show that Ragnarok was never a single fixed message. In the poetic Edda, especially in poems such as Völuspá, the end is told in compressed prophetic language. The focus is on signs, names, and sequences of doom. The seeress lists the omens in a style that feels older than later prose summaries. In Snorri Sturluson's prose Edda, written in the early 13th century in Christian Iceland, the same material becomes more orderly and explanatory. Snorri wanted to preserve older poetic knowledge, but he also framed it for an audience living in a Christian culture that understood world history differently. That does not make his account unimportant. It means it has to be read carefully. The myth survived after its original religious setting had changed, and that shaped how it was recorded. That difference matters because it shows how myth can move from living belief into remembered tradition. The older poem preserves a visionary cadence and a strong sense of inevitability. The later prose text arranges events more systematically, partly because it is trying to teach skaldic material, and partly because it belongs to a Christian intellectual world that preferred sequence and explanation. Modern readers often encounter Ragnarok through Snorri first, but the poem traditions preserve the sharper edges of the myth. Between them, we can see both the older religious imagination and the later effort to archive it. Later readers often notice the same tension. Some took Ragnarok as evidence of a pagan imagination that faced tragedy without denial. Others read it as a northern vision of history, in which glory is real but temporary. In medieval Scandinavia, and later in the modern period, the myth could be used as a marker of cultural identity, as a source for poetry and art, and as a way to think about endings that are terrifying but not final. 19th century artists and writers, especially in Northern Europe, often used the imagery of the burning world and the surviving remnant to express national history, apocalypse, or rebirth. In the modern era, the name has been borrowed repeatedly in literature, film, comics, and games, usually because it still carries the old idea that a world order can collapse and something new may follow. Its afterlife also shows how adaptable the myth has been. In the Romantic period, scholars and artists searching for older northern identities treated Ragnarok as part of a recovered ancestral past. In some contexts, it became a symbol of cultural renewal after political defeat. In others, it served as a language for revolution, catastrophe, or historical transition. That flexibility comes from the myth's structure. It is vivid enough to stay memorable, but broad enough to be reinterpreted. Even when its original religious meaning faded, the story kept its emotional outline. At the same time, it is important not to flatten the myth into a simple slogan about resilience. The old sources are clear that loss is central. Many of the gods do not survive. The world tree endures, but altered. Even the renewed earth is not the same as the one that came before. Ragnarok is not a comforting promise that everything returns to normal. It is a story about irreversible change, preserved in a culture that valued courage in the face of what could not be prevented. The surviving descriptions of the renewed world are brief, but they matter. They suggest a landscape in which some figures live on, order begins again, and memory of the old catastrophe remains part of the new age. The surviving world is not a denial of the first one's destruction, it is built after it. That is one reason the story still appeals. It does not imagine innocence restored, only life continuing after the collapse of what once seemed permanent. Ragnarok is not a simple tale of the world ending. In the surviving Norse poems and prose, it is a final battle in which many gods fall, old powers break, and the foundations of the cosmos are shaken. Yet the story does not end in silence. After the ruin, the earth rises again, green and renewed, and a few survivors carry memory into the next age. That balance helps explain why Ragnarok endured. It is a preserved story about fate that cannot be avoided, sacrifice that still matters, and renewal that does not erase loss. Later writers kept returning to it because it holds a hard truth in a few clear images. Endings are real, but they do not always have the last word.